Welcome to episode 6 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Today we're going to be talking about The Death of Stalin, a 2018 satirical historical comedy, we'll call it that, directed by Armando Iannucci, that does pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It's about the death of Stalin and the political and social strife that resulted from that historical event. So, as always, why don't we start out with our general opinions on the movie. Christian, Mitchell, what did you think of it?
Well, since you mentioned my name first, I'm going to assume that means that I'm entitled to go first, unless Mitchell would like to go first.
No.
Okay.
All right. I enjoyed it. I'm really glad that you chose this film for us to talk about, Zach. I think there's a lot to dissect here.
Okay.
I thought the script was fantastic, very witty, and the ensemble generally. I think it's a compliment generally that none of them stood out as particularly amazing to me, but that they worked well together. I think that type of chemistry suits a film like this well, and it's sort of a proof of concept when some of the funniest moments don't depend on the history or the satirizing of the actual history. Like, for me, one of the absolute most hilarious moments in the entire thing is when Svetlana and I believe Khrushchev are sitting on the bed, and Svetlana's so upset, and then she's like, "Who puts a lamp on a chair?"
Yes, that's a great moment.
Just a random observation. I don't know. They do a great job of combining moments like that with moments that specifically satirize the events that they're addressing. My only real issue with it is the last 15 minutes of the film take, to me, a really abrupt turn from comedic to dramatic and like dark.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we kind of see Steve Buscemi's portrayal of Khrushchev as kind of like this opportunistic, but also says kind of doofusy things a lot, and then at the end he's just kind of like, oh, this is a historical drama now. And I guess it sort of makes sense given the events. It's very hard to make the ending of this film funny and still historically accurate. But I still found that jarring, and for me, I gave it a 3 out of 5. It was good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. Mitchell?
I guess there's kind of a part of me that really wants to critique historical drama, even if it's just comedy, to critique it to no end. Not just like in terms of historical accuracy, but how I prefer these things to turn out, I guess you could say.
Yep.
But keeping my own bias aside, I really did like this movie. I think I also agree with Christian that it was perfectly cast. They worked together. They were very coercive and worked together very similarly to how the actual people did in real life, in terms of being a part of the Central Committee and things like that. And like Zach had written in his Twitter review, emphasizing the bureaucracy and how ridiculous everything is because there's committees and bureaus and the commissariat and internal affairs and all that other stuff. So that in and of itself is comedic. But on top of that, the actual random gags and the way that the actors portray themselves, and kind of just jostle about after meetings and things like that is very natural. It doesn't appear forced at all. But I think those are kind of my favorite moments. The subtle parts where I would be laughing a lot more if there was canned laughter, but just having natural conversations and things like that, just being funny even, and you can't tell whether or not it was intentionally supposed to be funny, are definitely of value. But overall, I really liked it. I don't usually laugh by myself, I guess, is kind of what I'm discovering with this. But my dad came by and he was like, "Oh, you're not really laughing that much." And I was like, "I don't know, Dad. It's kind of funny, but I'm not going to laugh to it quite yet." But yeah, I agree pretty much with everything that Christian said. And especially the last 15 minutes, that was really weird. How serious it had to have gotten. But yeah, I pretty much enjoyed it.
Okay. I would say I absolutely love this movie. This was one of my favorite movies of 2018. in hindsight, I would say it's probably one of my favorite movies of the last decade, and probably also one of my favorite comedies. I think this is kind of the style of comedy that I really enjoy, kind of that sort of darker, more satirical, almost mean-spirited element. I would compare this kind of comedy. Obviously, this is a much more serious subject matter, but I would compare this style of comedy almost to something like Ghostbusters, where the story itself is serious. Like, we have a straight plot. In this case, we have a straight plot that pretty much actually happened how it's depicted. But the funny thing is the characters and the dialogue that are wrapped around that plot. Christian, Mitchell, you guys both mentioned the ending and how you felt it was kind of jarring. But personally, I think that the ending is sort of the dramatic element creeping in, because I think the whole time this is kind of a satirical drama, and that ending is sort of confirming, like, okay, we can poke fun at it, but this was a serious period in history, and people died, and I think it's that ending is kind of sort of almost slapping the audience in the face and saying, now you've laughed, now here's the time to take this seriously. And when I first watched it, I definitely thought that ending was somewhat jarring. But looking back on it, there are sort of little windows into that deeper drama throughout the movie, I would say. The character and the historical figure of Beria, played by Simon Russell Beale, was a rapist, historically. They mention it towards the end of the movie, but he rapes somewhere along the lines of hundreds of women and young girls. And throughout the movie, there are little kind of tasteful windows into that. I didn't recognize it when I first watched the movie, but throughout the movie, like, guards are, like, leading young girls into his house, or he's, like, locking young women up in a cell so he can come back to them later.
I definitely caught that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think there are those little windows to the more dramatic elements before the ending comes along and really smacks you in the face. But personally, I love it. I'd say it's really worthy of the 4 out of 5 that I myself give it. But we have talked about the style of comedy a bit, but this is the second comedy we watched on the show, the first being Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery. So how do you guys think this kind of comedy compares to the kind of comedy used in that film? And is there one style or the other that you yourself prefer?
I personally prefer Austin Powers, and
okay.
that sounds like I really got to defend myself, so I'll try. But I don't know. There's something hard about mixing very dark humor with one-liners and kind of gags and just purposeful ignorance of the characters. And I understand the characters in real life were very ignorant and possibly, maybe to some degree, accurately portrayed. But I think there's many reasons why this period of history wasn't necessarily covered, and I'm not trying to get into the thing like oh, Jojo Rabbit shouldn't be glorifying Nazis or something like that. I would never say anything like that. But what I'm trying to say is that when you approach this kind of dark humor, what they did correctly is mix the drama and the humor, going back and forth and putting it all together. So it's kind of like a situation. It's like a car wreck, really, in a good fashion.
Okay.
Entertaining fashion.
An entertaining car wreck. All right.
Yes. But I mean, spy movies are a very easily playful target, and there's a lot you can do. There's a lot less risks that have to be taken. In association with that, I mean, there's right after World War II, there was, there's still plenty of horrific things going on in the Soviet Union, of course, but not nearly to the degree of World War II. But I feel as though the Central Committee members and the way that they were acting at that time, as goofy as they were still, I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to explain, but the Central Committee members in real life were very goofy characters, and obviously they did a lot of things they didn't really take very seriously when they very much should have, because they were blinded by nationalism and the totalitarianism from Lenin and Stalin and progressive ideals in certain respects. But I feel that once it gets politically complicated, it becomes much more of a crapshoot, I guess, in terms of what audience you're truly trying to entertain. Like I think the audience that they're trying to go for is much more blurry. Mm-hmm. So I would much prefer just having a more playful comedy rather than taking this type of period and satirizing it to no end.
You mentioned how politically complicated it is. Personally, I didn't think the audience was necessarily meant to understand all the politics of what was happening. Right. Because, I mean, the characters themselves openly admit at points that they have no idea what's going on. One of my favorite moments is they're in a board meeting, and there's so many proposals one after another, and Molotov just sort of says, I'm not quite sure I know what's being proposed anymore. And there's another moment where Malenkov says, I can't remember who's alive and who's dead. Like, you kind of get the impression that none of these characters understand what's going on, so you as the audience don't necessarily have to understand as well, or at least that was my impression. But Christian, what's your opinion on the style of comedy?
It's tricky, you know. As I'm sitting here twirling my facial hair, I want to say satirical, but when I'm with friends and I do not want to exert any of my brain power on anything, I would probably choose Austin Powers. I mean, it's kind of a toss-up for me, and I would say, like, in the moment, it's easier for me to enjoy something that's more slapstick, like Austin Powers, but as we're talking about the death of Stalin and looking back on it more, I find my opinion of it growing, at least critically. And just some bits of it, it's like, it's remarkable how this specific circumstance, the history just writes the satire, and the satire is the history. Yeah. Like they're standing around Stalin's unconscious, potentially dead body, and they're like caucusing about whether to call a doctor or not. Like,
yeah. The room is only 75% conscious. Yeah,
right. It's ridiculous, and it's a kind of a wonderful example of how tyranny and totalitarianism can backfire and work against the leader that instilled it in the first place. So I mean, it's a personal preference thing for anyone. But I enjoy both, and I think this brand of satire is more difficult to execute than something like Austin Powers. But I don't think I'm sure in terms of like cultural criticism, this is valued as higher art or whatever. But I don't think that one is unilaterally superior to the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with that. And like you said, Christian, it definitely writes itself. I mean, you know, the scenes like that, they really don't have to go too far from what actually happened to have it be comedic. And just having the casting that they do, especially Steve Buscemi, pretty much that just sells the whole thing. And that's definitely a good thing when comparing it to Austin Powers. I think that gives it a lot more merit as a comedy and as a film in general. And I would say that the complication is comedic in and of itself, and you know, having the convoluted schemes and the bureaucracy and stuff like that it makes it funny. But I also do think it takes away from the historical drama part of it, and it makes it a lot harder to take it seriously. You don't really know when you're like sometimes you know when you're supposed to be laughing. Obviously, like there's really obvious parts where you know it's supposed to be funny. But right when there are some parts that you're not really sure about, you kind of get, I don't know. I wouldn't say I get morally confused, but I don't really know what to feel. I'm just confused in general, I guess. My emotions and how I'm supposed to react kind of gets blurred. Like I didn't really know what they were going for. Yeah. And on Austin Powers, even as dumbed down and simplistic as it is as a comedy, I understand it's not very complicated. But that's my own personal preference and how I like to see those types of comedies. But I think the simplicity is its best. Its simplicity is its most meritable thing, I guess.
Sure. Okay. I mean, in defense of Austin Powers, it's not like that isn't ever clever. I mean, it's still well written. I think a lot of the jokes are witty in a different way. And I mean, it's kind of like what you're saying, Mitchell, is kind of like an argument I used to have with myself about Weird Al Yankovic and his music. And I used to be in this camp where I was like, I like my music serious. I don't want to listen to Michael Jackson talk about how he's fat, or I don't want Joan Jett to sing about how much she loves Rocky Road ice cream. Like I didn't want that to dilute the art and the music that I actually enjoy. And eventually I came around to it, but I totally understand where you're coming from with the issue of minimizing the drama, because these things happened and they should be taken seriously. So there's definitely a tricky balancing there.
And I wouldn't say necessarily that like the history itself always has to be taken seriously. Like I said, I'm perfectly fine with dark comedy, even the darkest of comedy. I'm perfectly fine with. I have a very high tolerance for that. But yeah, and I think it's just it's me being confused with what the director really wanted. I guess it's kind of what they're trying to achieve versus what actually comes on the screen and how I look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really just a confusion between it's just a difficult time period to satirize.
I think it's interesting you point out sort of the blurring of the line between reality and the humor here as almost a negative, because for me at least that's one of the things that makes it feel like this satire has really worked, when you can't really tell the difference between, wait, did this actually happen or is this just a joke? I think that's kind of the proof of like, wow, the satire has worked here, and they've really kind of exposed what a farce sort of these events kind of were after the death of Stalin actually took place. Some of the most ridiculous things in this movie actually happened, like the whole opening sequence where Stalin calls into Radio Moscow and says, "I want a copy of this this orchestra session that's just been played." I'm probably using the wrong word there. I'm not a music man, but and there isn't they didn't make a recording. It went out live, so they have to pull everybody back in, and they've got to get everybody back in the studio. That actually happened. That was something that actually happened, and they had to pull in bums from the street to fill out the rooms. The acoustics would be the same, and hope Stalin wouldn't notice. And I think when you get to a point where you can't necessarily tell the difference between what actually happened and what's a joke, I think that's kind of sort of the ultimate testament to, wow, my satire has really worked. You can probably tell from the way I'm talking, but I personally prefer this kind of humor to Austin Powers, or an Austin Powers kind of spoof situation.
Really?
When we talked about Austin Powers, I mentioned that I really wished the film had had some sort of straight aspect to kind of lead us through the jokes. And I think this
Austin
movie,
Powers is straight.
Steady on now.
Geez.
And I think this movie definitely has that. This movie is the kind of thing I was talking about, where the plot is dead straight. That's a serious thing, but there are jokes and funny characters built around it. And that's the sort of thing I felt was kind of lacking in Austin Powers, where it's kind of just all silly all the time. But we have mentioned the cast and some of the actors quite a bit. So let's maybe focus in on that a little bit more. What were you guys' thoughts on the characters and the casting in this film? Because we've got quite a big ensemble cast of big-name actors here. Either Mitchell or Christian.
Michael Palin gang.
Yes.
That's my boy. As Molotov. All he had to do, he had very little that he had to accomplish, and he accomplished it way beyond expectations. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
Yeah. This is kind of a cop-out answer, but I think that I don't know the characters' names or the actors' names, but the two guys in the recording booth for the orchestral performance.
Yeah.
And the bit in the beginning where they're trying to figure out how long it's been since he hung up the phone, and just the absurdity of measuring out the seconds. And I think those guys are, like, to me, that performance is kind of makes the movie for me, because we spend most of the time on Stalin's associates rather than the underlings that fall victim to these absurd demands and absolute things that they must follow. And so I'm sorry to not know those characters' names or the actors' names, but they were my two favorite. Within the cabinet, I think I probably just enjoyed Steve Buscemi the most because I actually knew who he was. But they were all great. So.
And Jason Isaacs too. That was a very big surprise for me, because I didn't read the cast list before this, just because I wanted to be surprised, and just seeing him as Yukov coming out with the scar and the medals and everything. That's perfect. That's literally that's a perfect archetype right there, and he did exactly what he was supposed to.
Yeah.
And then also Simon Beale, is that right?
Yes.
For Barry?
Simon
Yes.
Russell Beale, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely had a lot more screen time than I was expecting, but I think he really executed well, and was executed well.
He's basically the villain
by the end. Yeah, he is one of the main. He's one of the main characters, but
Yeah.
he actually had somewhat of an arc, I would say.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, and then Malenkov, Jeffrey Tambor.
Yeah. Tambor. Yeah.
Tambor. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, obviously he did a wonderful job. And once he become the general secretary, yeah, he definitely took that role and did a great job with that. But yeah, and of course Steve Buscemi. I mean, anytime he says anything, you're always anticipating him to say something funny. And even when he is being serious, he definitely has. So he has some experience in serious acting roles. That were exemplified. So I think he had a very good casting. And even as Khrushchev, especially towards the end, and knowing a lot about Khrushchev and reading and listening to his audio logs, I think he actually was relatively accurate to Khrushchev in real life.
Yeah.
Which is difficult for most audience members to decipher, but
I love they included the little scene where he's talking to his wife about these are the jokes that Stalin laughed at and these are the ones that didn't, because that's something that Khrushchev actually did. And I think it's great they included that detail to kind of emphasize, his whole funny man routine was a ploy to get to the top, or kind of make sure that he never disappeared like a lot of the rest of the people. I would agree. Christian said at the beginning, sort of one of the testaments to this cast is that nobody in particular necessarily stands out above everybody else. They kind of all blend in as like a funny bouncing off of each other ensemble cast. And I would definitely agree with that. I think that each of these actors, even though a lot of them are pretty big names, especially in Britain, none of them necessarily stands above anybody else as kind of the tentpole of the production. You mentioned the scene at the beginning with Paddy Considine, and I don't know the other actor's name either, but when they're in the recording booth with Radio Moscow, I think it's a big testament to this cast that somebody like Paddy Considine, who, even though he's only in like 2 scenes, he's a really memorable character. Just in the way he acts, you remember like almost every funny line he says when he's running out and telling everybody to take your seats and, do not defy me. Like, his stuff is some of the most memorable stuff in the movie. So I think that's kind of a great testament to how this movie takes well-known comedians and uses them in just the right way, in just the right place. Almost like... this is a bigger cast than Monty Python, but in some places it kind of feels like the way the different comedians in Monty Python bounce off of each other, where no one person is like, well, I'm the lead man of Monty Python. They all kind of feel like they're part of the same group and they're funny together rather than funny in isolation one after the other. One of the other most notable things in this movie is that nobody even makes an attempt to speak with a Russian accent. There's actors in this film from America, Britain, France, all over the world, and everybody speaks in their native accent, and nobody makes an attempt at a Russian accent. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why that decision might have been made, and what your thoughts were on that decision, and maybe what effect it had on your viewing experience.
At first, I definitely found it a little bit distracting, honestly. Like, I had to consciously remind myself that we were in the Soviet Union at the beginning, at least. And I have to go back to our old theater teacher, Mr. Rosen, who's slowly becoming a mainstay on this podcast.
Yes.
But, shout out to Mr. Rosen if you're listening. I remember, at least when we did Shakespeare stuff, a lot of the time that sometimes some of our peers would attempt a British accent without being directed to do so. And,
I was occasionally guilty of that.
Yeah,
oh my gosh.
I as well. And it's not that we never ever used accents in Shakespearean productions. In fact, when I was Kent in King Lear, he had me do an accent, a sort of a Liverpool-ish accent to denote that Kent was a lower class character.
Yeah.
But there's always this idea that an accent has to serve a purpose, and it's a little confusing if all of these Russian characters are speaking English in a Russian accent in Russia. It's a little befuddling, and at least to me, I find it harder to suspend disbelief with that multi-step semi-Russian approach, as opposed to just letting them speak in that language and in that accent and making it clear for the audience to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And like the more unified approach just makes more sense. And if a few of the characters were speaking Russian or in a Russian accent and the others weren't, then that would make absolutely no sense, which is something, again, our Mr. Rosen would stress to us if only a few of us tried an accent. So, yeah, I think that the way they did it made the most sense, given that it was supposed to be a production directed at English-speaking audiences. So
Right. And I've seen plenty of movies, especially older World War II ones, where they did not have German actors.
Yeah.
Did not have Japanese actors. They might have had Japanese Americans, but they didn't speak Japanese, or they just spoke English because they wanted audiences to not listen to Japanese, or the entire time, or they didn't want to have translating issues. And I think the big reason for this is, first of all, they had to have top-billed actors. They didn't want to have the top-billed actors trying to figure out how to speak Russian or having vocal coaching for a very, very long time. And their accents probably wouldn't be very good either. Another reason is that the Russian accent is really hard to understand if they're actually doing it perfectly.
Yeah.
And I guess another reason would be, well, actually, I think that's pretty much it. But like Christian said, would be Christian said the other thing was that it's for English speaking audiences, and there's really no point to having them all speak Russian or in a Russian accent when that's not the point of the movie. Like for example, there are other movies that have Russians as players, like national players in the movie, or like they have to have generals speaking on behalf of Russia, so they'll speak in an accent or even speak in the language. I'll use X-Men First Class as a recent example. It was very important to distinguish the Russians between the Americans in that.
Yeah.
So they had very, very American sounding, Americans, and then very Russian sounding Russians. So, I don't know why I brought that movie up, but
when I originally watched this film, I thought, oh, well, they're all speaking in their native dialects because it's funny, Isn't it funny to hear Stalin sound like a Cockney man, which you probably wouldn't expect. That is kind of funny. But funny. The other day I was watching a mini documentary on the History Buffs channel. Shout out to a good channel. Go check him out. And he suggests that it might have been a directorial decision to sort of emphasize the size of the USSR, because even though the USSR was one nation, it was massive. So there were people from various different cultures and people groups throughout the country, and they would have different accents, which I think is actually a pretty good point. You would get different members of the board or of the government who would speak in not necessarily a Brooklyn accent, but an accent that to Russian ears might sound almost like Steve Buscemi's Brooklyn accent, or Stalin's a good example. He was known to speak Russian with a thick Georgian accent. So that might sort of sound like how Cockney sounds to our English-speaking ears. And I thought that was a pretty good point, and might actually have been intentional on the part of the director. Speaking of Russia, this film did not necessarily do great in Russia when it came out. It was banned in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan when it came out. Russia's official statement on the matter was that it was part of a Western plot to destabilize Russia by causing rifts in society. So, with that governmental statement in mind, do you think they were justified in banning this movie in those countries, or do you think they should maybe lighten up?
Come on. Of course they're not justified in banning it, Zach. Come on.
It's worth discussing.
It is. No, because I think most Americans... Most Americans are not in favor of the Republic of Russia the way it is right now. And most people, if you look at Russians there now, there's actually a lot of Russians that fully support and believe in communism and believe in Stalin's Stalin as a martyr and his legacy. But Russia obviously has a very complicated past, and they only recently, only in 1991, were they no longer a Soviet Union, but obviously, as speaking from a democratic republic, I would say it's definitely not that is hampering their freedom, of access to entertainment. So yeah, they should have seen it.
Yeah, I would say legally, as Christian seems to very much have the opinion, it's not necessarily something you could justify. I don't think you can really justify banning any film or book or piece of media, but to a certain extent, I do kind of understand why the decision was made. As Mitchell said, communism and Stalinism is very deeply ingrained in Russia. There was a video I saw of two critics who were discussing this film on the news. And one of them was kind of leaning towards more of like a Stalinist perspective, and the other was very anti-Stalin. And that news clip from Russia resulted in a fistfight between the two reporters. So I would definitely say that opinions on this matter are run deep in Russia, and maybe it's a much more of a heated issue there than it is here. But I would say that you can't really justify banning any piece of media anywhere. I think any story or comedy or movie kind of deserves its time in the sun, which I think we can all agree on, I would say.
Yeah. It can't be that...
Well, you go, Christian.
I mean, thanks, Mitchell. It can't really be that heated of an issue if you don't actually let people discuss the issue and contemplate the issue as something that merits having multiple opinions and free thought. I mean...
Too bad, Gulag.
Exactly.
Well, okay.
I mean, the statement you read me, Zach, sounds like something that could have been in the script. Seriously.
Yes.
It's absurd.
I think that statement
absurd.
is outrageous. I'm not agreeing with the well, yes, it was part of a plot to destabilize Russia. I'm not saying that for a second. But I am saying that there definitely are probably people in Russia who would believe that. And maybe kind of preventing those opinions from rising up and those people getting angry again was kind of the priority rather than quell the outspoken anti-Stalin
My counterpoint
message.
to that is I think people that do believe that are not going to be influenced one way or the other, whether the film is released or not. If they believe that, then they believe that. And I think a nation's government formally releasing a statement about the work of art, condemning it as such, actually feeds those beliefs a lot more than if they were to actually publish the work and make it freely available to their citizens.
Yeah.
Well, that's what a Western puppet would say, Christian.
And regardless of the ban, there were a couple theaters that went ahead and showed the movie anyway, just kind of in limited showings under the radar, so they wouldn't get cracked down by the police. So I say good on them. And I think Kyrgyzstan, they didn't distribute the movie widely, but it did play at a couple festivals. So it's not like the movie was entirely squashed. It just had a harsh Russian finger wagged at it. Well, that brings us to the end of my discussion notes, but before we go into the rundown, I think we should just go around and share any final thoughts, if we have them.
Mitchell, please go first.
Okay. Whoa. I've been pressured.
I'm sorry. I'm not ready.
Okay, well, I just watched this film just before this. I watched it. I just finished watching it about an hour or so ago.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes. It wasn't because I procrastinated. It was because I procrastinated and I came to a formal decision to decide to watch it today.
There we go.
But anyway, I really did enjoy it. I understand that I was not necessarily a part of the target audience, whatever that might be. But I did not particularly find it hilarious. There are definitely some scenes that you guys mentioned that I fully agree with, like the beginning, were definitely, those were definitely warranted. And I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about it. I'm confident in my 3 out of 5, but there's some aspects of it that I just can't let go, that I don't think, hold the moniker of historical drama very well. And I think there were some difficulties that they came through in the filmmaking process that they just could not get over based on that time period. So I feel as though even though some of those decisions they made were not entirely their fault, I think the faults that the period carries hurt the film overall as a comedy.
Okay. Christian?
Yeah, I think what Mitchell said is fair, and it's definitely something that I keep in the back of my mind. Over the course of this discussion and just generally thinking about the film as a whole, I think I'd probably amend my rating to a 3.5 out of 5. Because I did enjoy it a lot. I mean, I wouldn't give it a D- if I were grading it, so it feels wrong to give it a 3 out of 5.
Right.
I guess there's just so many isolated moments of hilarity that I can't do credit by just speaking them out here on this podcast, but I highly encourage anyone listening that hasn't seen the movie to watch it and to think deeply about it in the ways that Mitchell's addressing in terms of the historical drama, and to also enjoy the humor. That's kind of the beauty of the duality of this work. And I think sort of an overarching thought that's been reoccurring to me as I keep thinking about the way that the humor works in this film is the way that majority consistently rules in this government, which is such a democratic thing, and it's just utterly hilarious to me that sort of the whole idea of this communism Soviet Union thing is to be anti-Western and all this, but the inner circle, so to speak, reaches every decision unanimously. Like,
Yeah.
That's utterly hilarious.
Heavy quotes there.
But but like that, there's this whole idea, I guess, like the Marxist approach or whatever is that there's this proletariat uprising and the bourgeoisie will be beaten down. But what really happens, what really manifests, is this singular approach that doesn't take anyone's viewpoint into account and is almost a bizarre perversion of any weakness that they perceive in a Western approach. And I just think that complements the satire so well. And the simple moments like that write themselves and the gags. I was very impressed. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm really glad you chose this for us to talk about, Zach. And because I don't think I would have seen this film had you not brought it to my attention. So I thank you for that.
I'm surprised I haven't seen it yet until now.
I was surprised as well, Mitchell, yeah. I think, we've already heard from me. I absolutely love this film. I think it's a perfect storm of cast, director, and script. And additionally, I'm kind of a big fan of contemporary history. And so that kind of makes it the ultimate historical comedy to appeal to me. I think if you are looking for something kind of light and goofy, this isn't necessarily the place to go. But if you're a fan of kind of more mean-spirited, dry, almost like a more British style of humor, stuff like The Thick of It, which Armando Iannucci also made, stuff like Peep Show, that Mitchell and Webb look, then you will probably be a big fan of this. There's a lot of swearing, so if you're kind of against that, maybe keep some earplugs handy. But otherwise, I would definitely recommend that anybody that hasn't seen this film check it out. So without further ado, I guess we'll go over to your segment, Christian. I don't want to take away the name from you.
It's now time for the rundown. Soviet Union edition. All right, so I'm sure most of our listeners have already grasped the format of this segment by now, but a quick overview is 60 seconds of random topics and items related to the film we've discussed are thrown at Zach, and Zach has to respond with nothing but a rating out of 5. An arbitrary rating that he sometimes decides based on the color of the movie poster. So
sometimes, not always.
This segment is completely meaningless, but we keep doing it anyway for some reason.
Yeah.
Because Christian's ego.
Yes, that's exactly why. He's not wrong. Okay. Mitchell, I'm going to have you lead off on this one so I don't bungle the timer like I did in our last episode.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go.
Steve Buscemi's face.
3 out of 5.
Murdering Stalin with 1953 cyberbullying.
4 out of 5.
No one actually speaking Russian.
4 out of 5.
Hockey team plane crashes.
Oh, 4 out of 5.
Buscemi dropping the F-bomb.
4 out of 5.
Passing motions unanimously.
4 out of 5.
Simon Russell Beale as Beria.
4 out of 5.
Historical accuracy.
3 out of 5.
The General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
3 out of 5.
Compulsory applause.
3 out of 5.
Villains having face scars.
4 out of 5.
More English accent variety than costume variety.
4 out of 5.
Khrushchev's pajamas.
3 out of 5.
Diegetic music.
4 out of 5.
Promising someone that no harm will come to them.
3 out of 5.
Factionalism.
3 out of 5.
Malenkov's signature.
5 seconds.
4 out of 5.
Vasily's coaching skills.
4 out of 5.
Okay, we barely got it off.
Woo!
Our whole list. First time we got through all of them in a while.
Wow,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Capitalism destroyed.
Okay. So since we're wrapping up this episode, Mitchell, do you want to introduce what we'll be watching next time?
Final Countdown. Not by Europe, but it's the movie. The Final Countdown. It's a really big boomer movie from 1980. It's got World War II stuff. It's got sci-fi stuff. It's got Kirk Douglas. That's about it. That's all I got.
Okay.
Get ready.
Oh
So
my
pretty
God.
much the ultimate Mitchell choice for a movie.
Correct.
So
Wow.
if you want to hear us talk about The Final Countdown, tune in next time. Otherwise, that's it from us, Cookie Pocket, and we'll see you next time.
Das Vidania.
Das Vidania.